Will we have AGI in 2025? This and a lot of other predictions are going to be laid out today in this video. I'm going to also cover a lot of hardware and software topics, specifically many of them relating to open source and what I think my predictions are for 2025. And I look forward to reading your predictions in the comments below, so be sure to leave them down there, and also at the same time hit like and subscribe if you haven't taken a chance to do that yet. So to start with, I think one of the biggest things that we're going to see on the software side is a lot of talk around the definition specifically of what AGI is. Is it completing a test? Is it everybody just accepts it? I think there's different levels that people have of expectations for AGI, and communicating around those is something that not only companies but also thought leaders out there need to do a better job of. I certainly have my own viewpoint of AGI, and it is absolutely not based around any benchmarks whatsoever. So I really do look forward to reading and absorbing what you think AGI is. I think that AGI has a lot to do with an unquestionable unhumanness in its ability to rapidly iterate without human input. And we don't have that right now. We are closer, but we just don't have that. Will we have that in 2025? I'm going to lay that out at the very end of this, so make sure you stay tuned. I think we will see claims of AGI from several of the larger labs out there. And I think OpenAI in particular is going to launch a product and claim it is AGI, whether it is or not. And I'm actually pretty skeptical on that. I really don't think their 12 days of OpenAI went quite that hot. I think it was kind of rough around the edges. But I definitely think that there will be claims of it, and I think this is what will spur the conversation around exactly what is AGI. Is it in the eye of the beholder, or is it something that is just unalienable? A rite of passage to a new species. I think that's a fascinating topic. Next, on the software side, definitely I see China surging. And China is, especially with open source models, doing a lot of innovation. They're doing a lot of innovation with a lot less resources. We see Qwen now versus DeepSeek. DeepSeek is v3. It is a huge model. I do hope to be able to run it locally here, but definitely it is a challenge to run that locally. But even on the cloud inference, it's very, very good. And if you're looking at what they use to produce it, they used a fraction of the resources that the major labs out there use. So I think that we're going to see more continued innovation from China on the open source front, which is great because some of their models are actually very, very good. I am impressed immensely with Qwen, and getting a Qwen Vision, which Qwen Vision is out, is something that is on the to-do list. And so where do they take the lead first? In my opinion, the Chinese are going to take the lead on several of the benchmarks. Now, benchmarks is one of the things that I've talked about several times, and the complexity around coming up with benchmarks that make sense to people, users, consumers, versus benchmarks that make sense to other data scientists. The gulf between these is tremendous and huge, and I hope to close that a little bit with some of the things that I do on this channel. There's a lot of room for that gap to be closed. There's a lot of in-between excellent benchmarks on ML tests and excellent benchmarks in your everyday life. And so one of my beliefs around AGI is that when we see it really, really manifest, it's going to be in products that end users find incredibly useful. And there's going to be very little denial of the fact that it is absolutely adding benefit to their life and not just complexity, which right now it adds quite a bit of complexity. And the interfacing is clunky that we have right now. And that is on the next part of software. I think we see some much better refinement. I do like OpenWEBUI. I know that I've read the comments. There are some people that are absolute haters of OpenWEBUI out there. I don't actually have preference for any specific one of the open source front ends out there. I just use what I think works best for my setup, which is a multiple user setup scenario and also a multiple computer setup. So OpenWEBUI does a very good job for that. Its multimodal support is actually pretty darn decent. There are others out there, and we will definitely get to reviewing those. Time is one of the things that AGI unfortunately has not been able to create more of yet, though. We will see possibly two industries changed heavily with AI augmentation, and especially with generation of content from artificial intelligence. I think that's going to be the movie and also video game industries, as well as the customer service industry. We're already seeing a lot of customer service feedback loops that are being tied into AI. So I do think that there probably is a fairly decent chance that we could see some disruption in the job market, and that is a very large job market for customer support, specifically in areas where there's not a lot of leeway. I think discretion is not necessarily something that most companies out there are going to be willing to put in the hands of AI right now. Whether they should or not, of course, is a big question, but there are a lot of tests that have happened, and keeping up with a lot of that is one of the segments that I have that is probably going to get talked about a little bit more in 2025 is what are the societal impacts? How can you use this in your everyday life? And that actually moves on to the next part, which is we're probably going to see a really, really big demand increase for people that are skilled in implementing artificial intelligence systems into everyday scenarios for small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and also possibly even households. The demand for people to have really good cutting-edge home assistant technology is big. It is very big. The voice preview that just launched, even though they said they were going to have enough hardware, almost immediately sold out. So I think we're going to see a huge shift which specifically comes around voice, and the interface of voice to humans is one of the most primary ways that I think people will actually go about interfacing with their LLMs on a daily basis. I know certainly in this household it is very popular, and I think that it's going to be very popular in other households. Specifically, it's been very, very hard to use something like an Alexa or an Echo in the past and have meaningful conversations. Especially Siri was like one of the worst out there in my opinion as far as assistants, but definitely LLMs are capable of significantly better. This is a player that's already in the field, but they have not taken firm leads until pretty recently. That's Google. Google has been working behind the scenes on a lot of things, and the velocity of releases that we've seen from Google specifically have been very, very high, and the quality has been very, very good. I share a lot of other people's frustrations with necessarily the complexities of going through their dev setups and their dashboards and everything that, Google Cloud gives you the option to have, but also it is just a clunky mess. No user's going to mess with that. No end user's going to mess with that. Hobbyists maybe, but definitely no end user on a normie basis. They do have a lot of integrated products already, so I think they will have capabilities that are surfaced through those which are pretty darn good. As well, speaking back to what I mentioned earlier, video game and specifically video production, I think we're going to see a lot of generated content coming from Google with their Veo, which is a very, very good, very compelling video generation model out there. Definitely blowing Sora out of the water, making Sora look like an absolute joke. And they kept that under wraps, and they launched that just at the most opportune moment. So their timing was impeccable, their product was impeccable. They probably knew all of this going into it, but they absolutely smited OpenAI in that regard. And I would expect that Google has the resources, if they are focused and if they can bring things back, to launch a lot of really good, really challenging products out there for a lot of the other companies. Unfortunately, on the software side of things, I'm going to also make a couple of other predictions. These are maybe not what you're going to want to hear. We're going to see a huge push for regulations in the United States. Hell, in Texas, we're already seeing a huge push for regulations, and I am going to be doing some stuff around that specifically. But in the United States, I think the upcoming administration that is going to be on deck is going to do a pretty decent job, but I definitely think that we have to pay attention to Elon Musk and his support of the California AI regulation bill early on. So I do think that there is a little bit of what might be called doomerism in the administration, and I think that could lead to some onerous regulations. Unfortunately, that applies to things like open source disproportionately, because the impact for smaller upstarts is going to be essentially you won't be able to comply. That'll give the big players a vested head advantage. That's not good, and that is something that is very negative. And let me talk about something else that's very negative here. Europe. Europe is being left behind currently, and I don't see that changing. As a matter of fact, I see it getting worse. Whether or not they can even get access to video models is a good question. Now, I know that some people in the audience are definitely in Europe, and I definitely will be reading their comments below and interacting with you guys on those comments. But I think that the approach that we're seeing has also created a lot of problems for accessing the most cutting edge technology from the big players out there. And it's going to be a very controlled environment of who you're going to be able to utilize. It may not be the best for the situation, and deploying your own may not be something that is actually super viable to do because electricity rates can be quite high over in the EU also. So I think the European Union and in general Europe is facing a lot of challenges in this respect. I think if you're looking at Asia Pacific nations, there is massive innovation that is happening there. So I expect that to continue, and they are very, very forward-leaning into open source specifically, and I think we're going to see that continue also. And that actually has me quite excited. Next, I think we're going to see in 2025 something that's a little bit weird for me to say. You're going to have AI influencers in your life, and whether or not that person's real or not is going to become a question that maybe you ask, but maybe you don't ask. And there could be just so good of a tech out there that you don't have to ask. That is something I think is definitely going to be on deck. We're seeing already with Reddit the introduction of AI ghosts, essentially, so that they can create a wall around you. I think this does immense damage to the credibility of a platform if they don't disclose that to you. I think that is something that, you got to think about. Like, if they don't disclose you're echo chambering yourself with a bunch of ghosts on Reddit and nobody's actually seeing you, that could be like, that could be hard. Like, you got to wonder, like, if you said something right or wrong. And that makes life a really, really complex endeavor. So I think there's brands out there like Reddit that are doing incredible damage if they don't disclose what's happening in those regards. But I think there will be responsible disclosure on a lot of platforms of this is a artificial entity you're dealing with. Demand for implementation of these technologies is going to be through the roof. And that's why you should definitely hit like and subscribe to this channel, because I love getting the hands-on testing, and playing with these things is how you give yourself a bit of a competitive advantage, is one of my beliefs. I think that this is an emergent technology, much like document automation systems, actually probably bigger than that, probably a little bit more like the computer itself or the internet. So I think that we're seeing the advent of a really new innovative technology with LLMs. Whether that gets us to AGI or not is coming, so do keep tuned in. But definitely, I think that this is a big, big milestone of human evolution and possibly a new species coming around. Next, on the just kind of more nuts and bolts of models and LLMs. Smaller models have been rocking it. Their quality is amazing. We're seeing really good multimodal support. We're seeing really good vision support. And I think these things are going to continue. They're going to get better. The techniques are being refined right now. And we're going to see 128K just kind of become the standard for context windows. And we're going to see vision integrated into, in my opinion, everybody that wants to be a competitive model in 2025 for the most part. We're going to see very small models that are able to do these things very well also. Now, I think there's still a lot of reasons to have a big setup though, and that is because there will be big class models that the smaller ones are usually distilled from. Those will give you better quality, and those will also give you, probably in my opinion, a much better capacity to run multiple models at the same time. Something people are going to need to do more and more, in my opinion, is have multiple models. Certainly OpenWEBUI is focused on coming up with a kind of channels thing for its communication, which I think is fascinating. So you can have kind of multiple personalities of LLMs communicating with you at once. I like the sound of that. Now, let's move on to the hardware. So let me say first off, these are just my guesses, and certainly I have no inside information on this. These are just things that, from paying attention, I think happen in 2025. I think in the first couple quarters of 2025, we're going to see AMD actually get its act together as far as its driver support for ROCm, and I think they're going to ship very good drivers that are very easy to use, that do not require major amounts of integration work or tinkering work to get them up and running. The just works of NVIDIA and CUDA is what has made it such a powerful platform. And they definitely have acknowledged that there are some problems on the data center card side, but that also impacts the consumer card side, and that is everybody essentially that has an AMD GPU. This channel has not acquired an AMD GPU yet, but 2025 is going to be the year that I get an AMD GPU for testing also, so that we can take a look at some of the performance impacts of it. Their drivers are rough though, so there is a reason why people go green, and that is usually the reason. Next, this one's super important. You're going to want to stay tuned till the end because you want that AGI prediction, but definitely you're going to want to stay tuned also because when I give this analysis of what's happening, I think there's an impact at the end that is going to be important. The 5090 is a revolution in the fact that it has PCIe Gen 5, but it's also a revolution in the fact that it has 32 gigabytes of VRAM. But the one that really is going to matter, maybe the most, is its massive bandwidth bus that is going to be processing everything through. So I think we're going to be looking at a solid 35% performance improvement minimum per GPU. Bad side of that. This is unfortunate. They're going to be unattainable. So let me set that expectation right off the bat. I plan on going and possibly driving to Dallas or Houston. I don't know. So I can camp out and maybe get in line early enough to get one from a micro center. I have no other hope of getting one anywhere else. That is a sad state of affairs. And specifically when I talk about tariffs at the end, that's why you're going to want to stay tuned to this. Those things are going to be like gold. And so the real price of them, even though people are talking about the price of 5090s, is not yet known because the real price of them will be what scalpers are selling them for the most part, which is going to be unacceptably high in my opinion. Now, the difference between a 4090 and a 3090 for inference workloads was negligible. The reason why is because they had very similar VRAM bandwidth buses. So when you look at the 5090, it will not. It will be substantially faster. You will see a performance uplift there if you can get your hands on them. As far as the rest of the 50XX lineup, so let's say that you are looking at a 5060 that has 16 gigabytes of VRAM. I think that's a pretty compelling argument for a GPU to acquire. I don't see the 70s or the 80s being go-tos. I don't see the 70s or 80s being go-tos for any of the generations though. It just kind of has worked out that way. You either want to max out that RAM, which also maxes out the other specs, or you want to max out the RAM per dollar spent, which of course is at the bottom end. So 3060s with 12, 4060s, TIs I think, with 16, and of course the 5060s coming out with a disappointing still 16 gigabytes. So those are going to be your go-tos on that. And I think that playing either of the extremes is what most people should be looking at doing. I think that doesn't change. That does probably give you some good insights if you're looking at getting a 5080 or something like that. I would suggest maybe not doing it if it's just for inference workloads. 5070, probably not. 5060, 16 gigabytes, depends on price. Solid maybe. Next, I think if you look at the value that you see in the 4090s, I think I'm expecting to see about a 15 to 20% reduction in most used prices for those. I think that probably comes across as a lesser, but still their discount for the remaining inventory that they have of the 4090s, which is a fairly large amount of inventory that will be sold off also. But definitely probably a bit of a discount from where you're at right now on the 40 lineup for used. And I would recommend most people try to go used if you are looking for the best value out there. That is one of the things. New is just so much more expensive than used and refurbished right now, that gap is pretty darn big. Next, Intel. This one actually is pretty interesting. This one could kind of come out as a surpriser. I think the 12 gigabyte GPU is really, possibly one of the best launches that they've had. So good that it's actually become unattainable at MSRP. So you're going to have to pay as much as a 4060 16 gigabyte. No. So there's reasons why I don't think that it makes sense. Unfortunately, they have fallen into the same trap that Intel always does with their GPU lineups. If they have something that looks pretty decent, they don't supply it. And this trickles directly into the next thing. There's a lot of interest right now in people looking at what is planned for them to be launched as a 32 gigabyte card in the workstation class. I'm not counting on that being obtainable first, because they have a very, very big history of making those very hard to attain. and definitely not cost economical. So that, unfortunately, is their trend that has been, so far, their GPU trend for supplying their edge workstation data center kind of GPUs that aren't necessarily going into a rack. It's just very, very difficult to get them. So the price, unfortunately, reflects that also. Usually, if you look back at their last generation Alchemies, they were in their workstation and edge classes just ridiculously priced. So I think that's what we're going to see in that class. But the 12 gigabyte GPU actually is a pretty interesting option if they can get the supply of them launched. And they clearly have some supply issues because they have not came back down to MSRP prices. I would have picked one up by now. Unfortunately, I think that we're going to be looking at these things getting worse and worse also. We'll get to that here. Next, really cool hardware edge devices, not necessarily huge interfacing amounts of LLM processing monstrous power will be in them, but I think we're going to see lots of these cool little edge devices coming out. I think a lot of them are going to be around home automation and interfacing with LLMs. They're really, really fun. I got 2 of the new voice previews from Home Assistant, and I think that they're fantastic little devices so far from the very limited testing I've been able to do with them. The new audio input is great. The speaker, of course, has to be augmented with a real speaker, but that's not that big of a deal, to be honest with you. So I think we're going to see a lot of really cool, minorly powerful, but powerful enough for small models, specific use cases. We're going to see a lot of that coming out in 2025. Those are going to be some fun little things to test out. Finally, this is the wrap up, and this is unfortunately me wrapping it up on a little bit of a dire note. I think hitting AGI is going to be a tariff-limited endeavor for like the big training labs. I think this is going to be a really big challenge, actually. I think tariffs and the impacts of tariffs and what could be a tariff war coming down the pipeline, specifically around certain parts and components that are very, very hard to produce domestically, impossible to produce domestically, let's be honest, is going to lead to a new tariff rift that we haven't seen yet. So I think that that's going to be actually adding a tremendous amount of cost. That tremendous amount of cost actually probably will impact the amount of GPUs produced and the amount of GPUs that can be acquired. I think these are some big things to think about. Certainly myself, I am looking at RAM, flash storage, anything with NAND on it as going up in price. Displays probably end up going up in price. Motherboards and, unfortunately, new GPUs. Those are some of the things that I think are going to be impacted quite heavily if there are tariffs. I know I'm looking at a couple of different builds and I'm like, there's some things that I'm going to order from eBay that come speed pack from China. I'm ordering them now. So I would urge you to think about that if you have an accessory or something or a cable and you're like, maybe I can get it for $5 today. It might be $7 tomorrow. So that's one thing I would think about. If they're looking at like large ticket items, that one becomes harder because if tariffs hit at 20%, that's one thing. If tariffs hit at 50%, that's quite another. There's manufacturing, remanufacturing capabilities that kind of sidestep that if they go through Vietnam, if they go through Thailand, if they go through the Philippines, if they go through Taiwan, you can avoid some of those tariffs. But there has to be like meaningful remanufacturing in those areas for it to actually avoid that. And those areas can't have imposing taxes also, which is something that'll probably come under review also. So there's certain products that can be, like hard drives, for instance. Pretty easy to make those things happen from those countries. However, other things may not be quite as easy to make that happen, especially the more in-demand items. The higher the demand, the less pipelining it out to other places you're going to see. So those are my predictions for 2025. And the final one, will we see AGI in 2025? I don't think so. I'm going to be the person out here saying no and everybody else is saying yes. I do not think we hit AGI in 2025. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure that we're going to come up with a consensus on what AGI is, aside from the benchmark people are going to say benchmarking and the home people are going to say I should be able to just, never question that it's AGI. It should never make a mistake and it should be pretty perfect. So I think both of those camps are going to have some middle ground that they need to meet before we're going to be able to all sit down, look at something and say, without a doubt, that thing over there is AGI. And I don't think that happens in 2025. But 2026, maybe. I hope to read you guys' comments below. Thanks for staying tuned to this, and I hope your 2025 is off to a banging start. Everybody have a good one. I will check you out next time.